that the love is real, that the shoe might fit. She might just be my everything and beyond space and time in the afterlife. Will she have my kids? Will she be my wife? She might just be my everything and beyond.
Hey everybody, happy Friday. Welcome back to Morning Coffee with Rick Alexander. This has been a good week. We've had so many shares, so many listens. Last month, we absolutely destroyed our most listens in a month. And this month, I think we're going to destroy it again. So super excited. I just want to thank you guys all seriously for tuning in and for giving a shit what I have to say. I've been chewing on a lot of these ideas for many years. A lot of them will be in my new book that I'm kind of working out. But regardless of that, I just wanted to say a super heartfelt thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. And thank you for caring. And thank you for sharing. Damn, I'm a poet. All right, so the Huffington Post did a huge survey of thousands and thousands of people a couple years back. I think this was 2015, and they said to everybody, if you could have more of anything in your life, what would it be? And do you know what the number one answer was? I'm sure you could guess. Happiness. Everybody wanted more happiness. Now, here's a really interesting thing. Despite the fact that that's the number one thing that everybody seems to want more of, we don't spend a lot of time trying to cultivate it in our own lives. We take time to cultivate more money. We take time to get more responsibility, to climb the ladder at our job. We take time to try to get more relationships or in better relationships or in a relationship at all. But we don't try to cultivate happiness for the sake of it. Because what we're all counting on, essentially, is that those other things that I just mentioned, money, job, relationship, all of those things are going to correlate to more happiness. And so we set those as the prize. We set that as the thing that we're shooting for. But what if they're not related? What if you don't need those things in order to be happy? And I know I did an episode on money a little while ago, and I did an episode on social media and things like that. But this is different. So I'm going to share a personal story real quick, and then we'll talk about some of the ways that I've seen this manifested in my own life and how you might be able to figure out what your sort of minimum requirements for happiness actually are. So I've talked about it on the show, but I went on this trip. It was about a week long off the coast of Maine where we went sailing. And when we went and did this, we did a bunch of meditation, and there was sort of a curriculum to it, and we were the test pilot for this group, and I'm sort of always just down for a new experience or a new adventure, so I decided to go on it. But as soon as I got there, one of the things which I didn't actually count on was the fact that they were like, okay, we're going to collect everybody's phone before we leave. And I'll be honest, I had a moment. I was like, no, fuck you. You're not taking my phone. I need this thing. The reality is I don't need it, but I think I'm deeply rebellious. And I was just like, you're not taking my phone. So I talked to him about it for a while. And then finally I'm like, well, I can't be the guy that just doesn't give him my phone. So gave him my phone. And the first probably 48 hours I would describe as turbulent. That's what it felt like. It was like this sort of, you have the phantom text, and I'm always oh, what time is it? And I'm looking. And this was a really interesting experience because there were so many of us shoved on this little boat that we had to live on. And so you didn't even really have your own space, let alone a time where you could veg out and look into a screen or whatever. But anyway, so the first 24 to 48 hours were turbulent, and I sort of hit this, I don't know, I just kept thinking about my phone, and I kept thinking about the things I had to do and my emails and my lists and all the shit that the complexities of life that we are sort of obsessed with in 2018. But then something else happened. At about 72 hours, I hit this point where I realized all of a sudden I had all this extra space in my mind. And I think it was just probably a byproduct of not having all these inputs, but more than just extra space in my mind, more than just having freedom within my mind to think about things in a little bit of a different light, I also noticed my baseline level of happiness actually rose. So I would wake up in the morning and I'd actually be drinking really shitty coffee. And I'd be sitting on the front of the boat looking out. Coast of Maine, of course, is beautiful. But all of a sudden I had this weird feeling. It just sort of came up from the bottom, and it was like, holy fuck, I'm happy right now. Legit through and through happy, and I don't even know why. Now, part of it I think is because, and I talk about this a lot in my book, Burn Your Couch, but comfort and happiness are not related. Those two things are not the same thing, although we often act like they are in Western culture. But take all of that aside, it was the simplicity of it, I believe. And I think that's what's interesting is once simple becomes happy, then being happy is really fucking simple. But we try to make it complex. We always think we need a new app for that, or there's always something new that we feel like we need. And it's interesting because all of the complexity, I don't believe it's actually making us any happier. And I remember there was one day, probably on the 4th day, and I think we were out there for 6, we were all eating soup, which it's not good. We literally made it on this little burner on the back of the boat. And it's pouring rain, and there's no indoors in this boat. And we're all sitting there in our ponchos eating soup, and it's pouring rain. And we're just laughing our asses off, and we're joking, and we're kind of going through this shared adverse experience. And not only was it a reinforcement of this idea that comfort and happiness aren't related, not in the least bit, and then to take it a step further, in fact, you actually have to ditch a little bit of that comfort in order to find more happiness, which is a paradoxical sort of thing that humans have trouble grappling with. But then on top of that, it was this idea that this is the simplest thing I could possibly be doing right now. And so I realized for me to be really happy, the only 2 things I need are some dope people and an adventure. Literally, that is it. That is like my baseline requirement for happiness. And everything else, once you get that, everything else, like a warm meal, it just becomes supplementary, and it gets to add to the happiness. And so the thing that I would like to leave you with today is this idea that, do you know what your baseline level of happiness requires? Do you know the minimum requirements for you to be happy in this world? So what's interesting is, because I realize that, now I realize that as often as I can, at least like monthly, I have to figure out a point where I can actually ditch my phone, ditch the complexities of life, find somebody really cool and go on an adventure. And that's literally just what my life requires in order for me to be really happy. And I am totally down to cultivate that. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be intense at times. Sometimes you're going to miss the mark. People aren't going to be as cool as you thought they were. The adventure could go awry. Things are going to go wrong. But this idea that I actually have an understanding of what makes me tick, what makes me happy, and now I have something that I can always go back to, something that I can always cultivate. And I don't know, there was a study a while back where it said, it was trying to figure out whether money could buy happiness. And the interesting thing is that they found that money does buy more happiness up until about $70,000 per year. And then after $70,000 per year, the relative level of happiness didn't really rise with the money. But I've done a ton of time. I've been to 57 countries in the last 12 years. I've spent a ton of time in third world countries. And one of the things that I noticed is, although they don't necessarily have means, in having a conversation with people that come from this country, they're not less happy. They're not notably less happy. And we're not even talking $10,000 a year. Like I've hung out with people that make very, very, very little money. And I'm not quite sure why we have this idea that complexity is required for happiness. Another thing you can look at is the fact that as a line of wealth tracks up within a nation, so doesn't the depression rate. And I think one of the reasons behind that is because as we add more wealth, we add more complexity, and we are assuming that complexity is going to make us happier. And unfortunately, I've realized in my life it just doesn't. And so I would just say, if you can think back over the last few years, I'm sure you, just like everybody in this Huffington Post study, wants to be happier. But if you can look back, think about the things that you were doing when you were really, really happy. And that wholesome, fulfilled feeling of happiness that is honestly pretty rare in 2018. When you've had that. Think about what that was, and then start seeing if you can sort of take a reductionist method to that and figure out what is your minimum requirement for happiness, and then how can you build it into your life to where you get to go back to that baseline level of happiness every once in a while, just to make sure that everything is on the right track, that things are going well. And so I like it because it serves as this point where I can sort of check in with myself, and I can say, like, is the complexity of my life, is the things that I'm doing, are they taking me further from the path, or are they taking me closer? Am I actually happier in my life? But we don't stop to think about that very much, and we certainly don't stop to think about the things that we would need to do in order to cultivate happiness, yet that seems to be what everybody wants. So maybe that's something you can build into your own life. I hope you guys have a great Friday and a great weekend, and I will talk to you guys on Monday on Morning Coffee.